Okay, so now we're going to do the last of our series on adolescence. So two general aspects of the social cognition of adolescence that change are perspective taking. This is supported by adolescents' ability to consider more abstract concepts. Also, there's Selman's research on friendship that fits here for talking about adolescents' ability to use perspective taking. This seems like a contrast, but it's not actually a contrast. Also, we see a emphasis on adolescents' egocentrism. So they're a different kind of egocentrism from what we see in childhood, but adolescents also show egocentrism, and Elkind's research kind of deals with this. Okay, so first, perspective taking. This is the ability to understand the thoughts and feelings of others. And Selman's theory of perspective taking is that there are stages by which children through adolescence increase their perspective taking ability. And the egocentrism of childhood ideally develops into mature perspective taking in adolescence and adulthood. We see this in the case of mutual perspective taking in early adolescence, and then later we moved to the conventional, social and conventional perspective taking. So let's back up a second. So mutual perspective taking is I understand that another person has their own perspective and that person is considering my perspective, right? So I understand they've got their own thing going on and they're looking at mine, what I'm got going on. So that's mutual perspective taking. And then the social and conventional perspective taking is the idea that I can imagine that there are social conventions that aren't so embodied. It's not like Johnny believes this. It is normally the case that blah, right? These are social conventions, and we can understand how to adjust our interactions to better fit those, but also imagine how other people might view us in the light of social conventions. So egocentrism we see in two different kind of manifestations in adolescence. And the first is the imaginary audience. As I spoke of before in the last video, this is adolescents having trouble distinguishing their own thinking about themselves from other people's thinking about themselves. So the way this manifests is that I think that other people are thinking about me and thinking that what I'm doing is important at all times. The next is personal fable, and this is belief in this imaginary audience that's paying attention to me at all times, and that there's something special or unique about you. Fits with an optimistic bias that we'll talk about in a second. So imaginary audience is akin to, I believe that everybody has noticed the fact that my fly has been down all day. And personal fable is not only have they noticed, but they care, and something important is going to happen because of the fact that people were paying attention. Both of these disappear with, or don't entirely disappear with age. When we are under cognitive or emotional stress, they may be particularly difficult for us to kind of deal with. People have theorized that this has to do with the fact that adolescents are so consumed with figuring out where they fit in the world, that who they are and how they fit with others, that they are seeing everything through this view of their identity. Okay, so optimistic bias. Again, this is related to personal fable. The idea of this phenomenon, lots of the observations of this phenomenon come from health psychology. And this is folks can be seen in folks tending to think that the accidents or bad things are more likely to happen to other people than ourselves, and the good outcomes are more likely to happen to us, right? Most people don't win the lottery when they play, but I will. And most people don't crash when they drink or when they drive after drinking, but or most people do crash or drive poorly after drinking, but I won't. Both adolescents and adults have problems with this. In adolescents, this may be more problematic in that the hormones that they're experiencing and the ways that the brain interacts with those hormones, reacts with those hormones, creates some problems for the brain being particularly excitable, which we'll talk about in a second. But also that their inhibition may be particularly of behavior or risk aversion may be diminished, particularly when they're in social situations. So adolescents tend to have more optimistic bias than adults, but adults have it too. So here's an example. So in terms of smoking, if you look at adolescents in yellow, adults in blue, most folks, whether smokers or non-smokers, agree with the statement. This is percent agree with the statement. Most people who smoke all their lives eventually die from an illness caused by smoking. And that one on the right, most people who smoke for a few years become addicted and can't stop. Again, smokers and non-smokers on the middle graph, lots of agreement there for both smokers and non-smokers. Non-smokers agreed more with the idea that those who smoke for a few years become addicted and can't stop. But there's not a ton of difference between adolescents and adults in either case, right? And these are when we're talking about for most people. Now look what we see with non-smokers and smokers for when we talk about the same kinds of questions for me. I doubt that I would die from smoking, even if I smoked for 30 or 40 years. So this is percent agreement. And again, these are smaller percent agreements, but there's still a bigger difference between adolescents and adults, particularly if you look at the paired graphs on the right of each of these, where we're looking at smokers, right? So I doubt that I would die from smoking if I smoked 30 or 40 years, right? So it's not going to kill me. For most people, smoking for a long time causes, they end up dying from something related to the smoking, but not for me. And then I could smoke for few years and then quit if I wanted to. And importantly, the smokers who are adolescents had a greater agreement with that statement. They believed that they could quit if they wanted to. Adult smokers also did agree with that. So there's some bias towards supporting their behaviors as well. So the next thing I want to talk to you about a little bit here is the frontal cortex development and myelination in adolescence. So one of the last parts to develop in the adolescent brain is the frontal cortex, where we make a lot of the higher order decisions. And the myelination, or the myelin coating around the nerves in this part, is not as developed in adolescence as it will be later into emerging adulthood. There's also a lot more pruning to do. We have a period in adolescence of rapid connections built between neurons, but there's still a lot more pruning or kind of adjustment to do of keeping the connections that are used and getting rid of those that aren't used. So because adolescents are accessing and still kind of developing this frontal lobe slower than adults, this may impact their judgment, particularly their judgment in situations that are highly emotional, that are highly in social contexts, or with not a whole lot of time to think about their choice. Okay, so looking at a common aspect of teen behavior. G. Stanley Hall talked about adolescence as a time of storm and stress. And Arnett has a key piece in that came out in 1999, quite old now, but that looked at 3 aspects of storm and stress that Hall mentioned, and whether we could actually find these using empirical research. So Hall talked about conflict with parents, mood disruptions, and high and risk behaviors. So Arnett proposed a modified version of this that considers some cultural differences in here, but he mostly found that lots of these are actually justifiable with empirical studies. The change that Arnett talked about was that these aren't all adolescents are getting completely off the handle with these new behaviors, but that there are different ways that we conceptualize what it means to be adolescents. And that there are some ways that we may observe these and make these kind of the situation worse culturally. Okay. So what are some explanations for increased conflict with parents? Some people have talked about this as being a modern substitution for physical departure from your family. So it can help you with creating your own identity and moving away from dependence on your parents. So it's moving towards autonomy. Oh my God, I am so not my mom, right? So this also may relate to a gap between parents and adolescents' views on readiness. I remember an incident when I was in high school where I totally thought that I was ready at 16 to go to a party with a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds who were drinking and happened to all be guys, and I was the only female there, and we were out on a school night at the beach. I was totally safe because I knew these guys and it was going to be fun. Well, I knew one of them and that he knew the other guys and it was going to be fine. Right? I had put myself in a really dangerous situation, but I thought I was ready to make that choice. My parents disagreed. So children are now in adolescence having more cognitive ability to argue, so they're better at reasoning. They have these abilities to consider ideals and be critical of the world not meeting their ideals, right? I should be able to go out and hang out on the beach with a bunch of older folks who are drinking. It should be safe for me to do so. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is, but it should be, right? The other thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the course, is that parents are also going through their own transitions here. So as kids are kind of shifting away from their parents in some ways and claiming their own identities, claiming their own autonomy, this is shifting the parenting role a little bit as well. So parents may be focusing their lives on different aspects of different goals, rather than being primarily parents as their number one role. Okay, so we worry a lot for adolescents about peer pressure and conformity. Good news is that the most of the peer pressure and conformity, where we see the greatest influence, is in dressing, grooming, and social activities. So we see a lot of influence in what people wear and how they present themselves, but also how they spend their time. The issue here is that while this conformity and this peer pressure may not impact my life values or educational plans, right? It's not as influential on those things. If my social activities change significantly, and I'm ditching math class every day because that's what my social activities are doing, then that may eventually end up changing my educational plans, right? And while adolescents have the capacity to plan and think reflectively about those choices, they don't often do so, especially since they're often made in the moment and when in a social context, right? These are the worst possible scenario for making choices for adolescents. The other thing to say here is that peer pressure is linked to adolescents having high self-esteem. If they have high self-esteem, they're more resistant, and authoritative parenting. The idea with the authoritative parenting is that it has given kids models of talking through, arguing against a point of view. The other thing that we do to talk about social well-being and what's going on with adolescence is what we've called has been called a sociometric technique, and this is where we look at peer acceptance by asking other students, their peers, who they like or dislike, getting ratings on their peers. So if you get high ratings, you would be popular. If you get low ratings, you would be rejected. If you get some high, some low, you'd be controversial. If you get not a lot of ratings from anybody, you would be neglected. So we see that kids who have high ratings or who have high ratings, that tends to be moderate in terms of its stability. Controversial kids, with some people rating them highly and some people rating low, that does not tend to be very stable. On the other hand, rejected kids who are actively disliked by their peers, this tends to be high in stability because they don't have a lot of opportunities to change their social status because they don't have the access to experience to do so, right? They may not be able to learn other models for interaction because they don't have interactions going on. This also relates to how we attribute situational versus dispositional motivations for things. So people who are popular or well-liked have high social status. We tend to think they do good things because they are good people, so dispositional. And if they get in trouble or do something poorly or make a bad choice, it was the situation. We make the exact opposite attribution for folks that are disliked, rejected, right? We assume that if they do something negative, it is because of who they are. And if they do something positive, it is because of the situation. So our attributions kind of help to increase the stability of those peer relations or those statuses. Some more descriptions of these 4 basic types, and I'll let you guys read that on your own. In adolescence, we tend to see kids hang out in cliques and crowds. This is much more common for earlier adolescents. So a clique is 5 to 7 close friends. A crowd is a larger group, right? So I hung out with 5 to 7 really close friends. In junior high, we called ourselves the Hoochie Crew, and some of the girls were a part of a larger group who were the band folks. I was not. Some other of the groups were a part of the guys we hung out with. Some of them were a part of the soccer team. So your parenting style can predict crowd membership, but there's a predictable change across age in how kids interact with peers and with cliques and crowds. And so here is that lovely stages of peer development. And this is, I'm going to offer as very heterosexist and very gender binary. What occurs with kids how this looks or pans out in kids that do not identify as cisgendered or heterosexual. We have fewer studies coming that are giving us that info, but it may or may not look similarly to this. This is based somewhat on trying to explain the departure from heightened gender segregation that the kids were doing in early middle childhood um, to dating and hanging out in multi-gender groups as teens. Okay, so then the transition to adulthood. Part of the difficulty and people have talked about with adolescence is that we no longer have a specific thing that you do, a specific time that you become an adult. There are lots of milestones. There's getting to vote. There's being able to drive. There's graduations. But the full adulthood is not necessarily agreed upon as this is when that happens, legally or politically or socially. And as puberty starts earlier, and more and more years of education are required for most jobs, not all, most jobs that make a living wage, we have more of this in between time between childhood and adulthood, right? So if we start puberty at about 12 years old, and that's getting younger, and it takes longer if we say that it takes getting your BA to be an adult, right? Getting a 2-year degree after high school. Maybe it just takes a high school diploma, but different communities mean that adulthood may be different things. Becoming a parent, maybe, right? So when it ends is questionable, right? And the other part here is that schooling and other social kind of structures tend to separate adolescents and adults. So there's not lots of good opportunities for mentorship across generations there. This may be part of why there is the storm and stress in some ways for adolescents. Not so much about hormones and changing bodies, because we have that, but that's usually end of middle childhood, right? It's getting younger and younger. It's more the ambiguity socially about social roles and some of the cognitive changes that are going on in the brain at this time. All right, and we'll come back to talk about emerging adulthood.